Augustine wrote one sentence about the death of his son. He wrote 400 pages about almost everything else. You have almost certainly never heard the name Adeodatus. The man who gave Western Christianity its understanding of grace and original sin, the man whose Confessions remains one of the most emotionally unguarded books in the history of religious writing. That man looked at the death of his teenage child and moved on in a single line. This episode is about the boy he buried. It is also about what that silence cost and what it built. His name was Adeodatus. The word is Latin, and it means given by God. Augustine of Hippo gave him that name himself, and the name tells you something important about how this father understood his own paternity, as something that had happened to him, rather than something he had chosen. Augustine was approximately 19 years old when Adeodatus was born, somewhere around the year 372 AD, in the North African city of Carthage. He was not married to the boy's mother. He would never marry her. He would eventually dismiss her from his household when Adeodatus was approximately 15 years old, sending her back to North Africa from Milan so that he could pursue a more socially appropriate match, an arrangement engineered largely by his mother Monica. In his Confessions, Augustine described her departure with a line that has unsettled readers for 1600 years. The woman with whom I was in the habit of sharing my bed was torn from my side as an obstacle to my marriage. She had been with him for more than a decade. He never wrote down her name, not once. Not in the Confessions, not in his correspondence, not in any document that has survived. In the historical record of the early church, the mother of Augustine's only child is anonymous. That is the world into which Adeodatus was born. A world where his mother had no name in the record. A world where his father was brilliant, restless, and not yet the man history would remember. And a world where the child himself, by his own father's written testimony, was one of the most extraordinary young minds of the 4th century. You have probably heard of Saint Augustine. You may have heard that he was a saint, that he had a famously disordered youth, that he prayed, "Make me pure, but not yet," that he wrote an autobiography that became a cornerstone of Western literature. What you almost certainly have not been told is what the Confessions says in 2 brief lines at the end of Book 9, and what those 2 lines carry. The story of Adeodatus is not a footnote to his father's conversion. It is the weight behind the theology. The history behind that weight has a date, a name, and a grave. The 4th century Roman world that shaped both Augustine and Adeodatus recognized a legal institution called concubinage, a long-term, stable relationship outside of formal marriage. This was not prostitution, and it was not slavery. The Roman legal tradition, as recorded by the 2nd century jurist Gaius in his Institutes, distinguished concubines from wives and from women of lower legal categories. The arrangement was documented and afforded limited social recognition. The children of such unions, however, occupied a legally ambiguous position. They were classified as natural children rather than legitimate ones, which meant they could not automatically inherit their father's property or social rank. They existed in a middle space, acknowledged by their fathers, present in the household, but marked by the circumstances of their birth in everything the Roman world measured by inheritance and standing. Adeodatus was born into that space. Augustine spent the early years of Adeodatus's childhood in Carthage, in the Roman province of North Africa, what is today the nation of Tunisia. He was teaching rhetoric, the art of persuasive writing and speech, and he was recognized as exceptionally gifted. He was also, during these years, a committed member of a religious sect called the Manichaeans. The Manichaeans followed the teachings of a 3rd century Persian prophet named Mani, who taught that the material world had been created by an evil power, that the God of the Hebrew Scriptures was inferior and malevolent, that human bodies were prisons trapping fragments of divine light. Augustine later described this period in Confessions, Book 3, as 9 years of intellectual and spiritual captivity. But in the years when Adeodatus was a small child, this was not history. It was the philosophical atmosphere of the household in which his son grew. Then something completely unexpected happened. In 383 AD, Augustine secured a teaching position in Milan, one of the most important cities in the late Roman Empire. he moved north. Adeodatus traveled with him, along with the boy's mother and Augustine's close friend Alypius. Adeodatus was approximately 11 years old. In Milan, Augustine encountered Ambrose, the bishop of the city, a man of formidable intellectual gifts whose reputation had reached every educated household in the Western Empire. Augustine attended Ambrose's preaching initially as a professional exercise, the way a craftsman watches another craftsman work to study the technique. What he heard from Ambrose, particularly Ambrose's method of reading the Hebrew scriptures as allegory rather than literal history, began to dismantle Augustine's Manichaean objections to Christianity. Ambrose, Augustine wrote in Confessions, Book 5, showed him that the God of the Old Testament was not the crude, malevolent figure that Manichaean teachers had described. The encounter did not produce an immediate conversion. It started a process that would take 4 more years. Adeodatus was present through all of it. In the autumn of 386 AD, Augustine withdrew from his teaching post in Milan due to illness, the official account ran, and retreated to a country estate called Cassiciacum, belonging to a friend named Verecundus. With him went Alypius, his brother Navigius, his mother Monica, 2 students, and Adeodatus. The boy was approximately 14 years old. At Cassiciacum, Augustine led what he later described as a philosophical community. Discussions, readings, sustained reflections on the major questions of knowledge and the good life. He wrote several of these conversations up as formal dialogues. One of them, De Beata Vita, or On the Happy Life, includes Adeodatus as a named participant in the recorded conversation. The boy was not there as an observer, he was there as a thinker. Then the record offers something no one expected. Augustine wrote De Magistro, On the Teacher. This text is structured as an extended philosophical dialogue between Augustine and his son. Scholars, including John Rist in his 1994 study Augustine, Ancient Thought Baptized, published by Cambridge University Press, date the dialogue to approximately 389 AD, following the return to North Africa. Its subject is the nature of language, whether words can actually transmit knowledge from one mind to another, or whether they can only point toward what the learner must come to see from within. Augustine's conclusion, drawing on the Platonic tradition he had encountered in Milan, is that true knowledge comes from an interior illumination, what he identifies as Christ, the inner teacher. But the most striking element of De Magistro is what Augustine says about the conversation itself in his later work, Revisions, written approximately 427 AD. That book of ours, On the Teacher, is a dialogue with my son Adeodatus, who was 15 years old in body, but whose intellect surpassed that of many older men. I contributed nothing to that young man except his conception. In everything else, it was you who formed him. The boy, whose name meant given by God, was, by his father's account, a gift that exceeded anything the father had produced. If the existence of this child, a teenager whose intellect his own father credited entirely to divine formation rather than to anything Augustine himself had taught, is something you have never encountered in your education in Christian history, you are not alone in that. The Augustine most people are handed is a portrait that moves quickly past Adeodatus. But the fuller portrait matters. What Augustine believed about human nature, about the transmission of sin across generations, about the body as both gift and burden. That theology was shaped by a man who had fathered a son outside of marriage, had lived with that son for 15 years, had watched him be baptized at midnight, and had then buried him before he turned 18. If this is the kind of history that has been missing from your faith, this channel exists precisely for that reason. Each episode goes deeper into the primary sources than the standard education in church history typically reaches. Subscribe and turn on notifications. This is not about unsettling what you believe. It is about giving what you believe the historical foundation it deserves. And leave one word in the comments that names what you feel, knowing that Augustine wrote an entire philosophical dialogue with his son, and that his son never reached adulthood. Now to the night itself, the Easter Vigil of 387 AD. In the 4th century church, as documented by the patristic scholar Henry Chadwick in his 1986 biography Augustine of Hippo, and by Peter Brown in his landmark study Augustine of Hippo, a biography, first published in 1967, the Easter Vigil was the primary ceremony for adult baptism. Candidates who had spent months in preparation as catechumens, those receiving instruction in the Christian faith, were baptized in the night hours between Holy Saturday and Easter Sunday. The ceremony involved water, anointing with oil, and first reception of the Eucharist. Theologically, it was understood as a complete break with the former life, death to the old self in the water, resurrection to the new. For Augustine, who had been circling Christianity for 4 years, who had read Neoplatonist philosophy and the letters of Paul, who had sat under a fig tree in a Milan garden in the summer of 386 AD and wept until a moment of interior collapse shifted something in him, this baptism was the culmination of a decade of restless searching. Here is what the record shows. Ambrose administered the baptism. The night was April 24th into April 25th, 387 AD. Among those baptized were Augustine, his son Adeodatus, and his friend Alypius. Adeodatus was approximately 15 years old. Augustine recorded this in Confessions, Book 9, Chapter 6. With us in that baptism was Adeodatus, my son after the flesh, born of my sin. Two phrases in that sentence pull against each other. My son after the flesh carries the weight of Paul's theological language in Galatians 4:23, where Paul distinguishes between what is born according to natural generation and what is born according to promise. And born of my sin is not a rejection of the child, but a theological categorization of the circumstances of his conception. Augustine was not denying Adeodatus. He was placing him inside a framework that attempted to make sense of how the boy had come to exist, and how they had both come to stand in this water on this night. A boy of 15, water, a bishop, a father who had been searching for this moment for a decade. This channel carries no sponsors and no advertisers, just the research. If that matters to you, the QR code is on your screen now, and the link is in the description. After the baptism, the group traveled to the port city of Ostia, near Rome, to wait for a ship back to North Africa. Adeodatus was with them. It was at Ostia that Monica fell ill and died. She was 56 years old. Augustine's account of her death spans chapters 10 and 11 of Confessions, Book 9. It describes a shared mystical experience, a conversation at a window overlooking a garden in which both Monica and Augustine seemed briefly to reach a silence beyond time, beyond words, beyond the movement of thought. It is one of the most celebrated passages in the history of Christian mysticism. Monica's death receives sustained, luminous attention. The grief is detailed and prolonged. Then they waited in Rome. Then, sometime in 388 or 389 AD, they returned to North Africa. And then Adeodatus died. He was approximately 17 years old. The cause is not recorded in any source we possess. No letter describes it. No companion's account preserves the details. What we have is the sentence Augustine wrote approximately a decade later in Confessions, Book 9, Chapter 6. You took him early from this earth, and I recall him without anxiety, fearing nothing for his childhood, his adolescence, or the whole of his person. We associated him with ourselves, at the same age as ourselves, to be brought up in your grace. That is the sentence. One sentence of retrospective peace, followed by a turn to other matters. Here is what no one saw coming. Peter Brown, in his biography of Augustine, expanded in a second edition by University of California Press in 2000, notes that the death of Adeodatus receives what he calls the most passing of mentions in the Confessions. Brown argues that by the time Augustine wrote the Confessions, around 397 to 400 AD, his theological framework had developed to the point where an early death, for a baptized Christian, was not primarily an occasion for lament, but for a kind of deliberate restraint. The boy had been received into faith. He had been taken before the world could do further damage. In the grammar of Augustine's emerging theology, this was not tragedy, it was mercy. The peace Augustine expresses in that sentence is genuine, but it is peace that has been shaped by a decade of theological development applied to a raw event. It is the product of interpretation, not only of time. The Augustinian scholar James J. O'Donnell, in his 1992 three-volume commentary on the Confessions, published by Oxford University Press, observes something that deserves more sustained attention than it typically receives. The structural asymmetry in Book 9 is striking. Monica's death receives multiple chapters of luminous extended attention. The death of an unnamed friend in Book 4, a loss Augustine describes in terms of a self split open, of days that were both a torment and a wonder, receives more text than the death of his own child. O'Donnell notes that Augustine's theology, by the time of writing, had developed an explicit account of what he called rightly ordered love. Love of any creature, including a child, was to be held in deliberate subordination to love of God. Extended grief for the dead was, in the framework Augustine was actively building, a sign of love that had been placed on its object with disordered intensity. To grieve at length for his dead son would be, in the architecture of his own theology, a demonstration of misplaced priority. The next move was not theological, it was personal. You may have been taught, or simply assumed, that doctrine explains behavior from the outside, that a person adopts a theological framework and then lives within it. What the Confessions shows is that the relationship runs in both directions. The experience shapes the theology, and then the theology reshapes how the experience is recorded, remembered, and written into the historical record. The Confessions was written 10 years after the events it describes. From inside a framework Augustine was still actively constructing when he put pen to page. What we read is not the raw event. It is the event passed through a decade of interpretation by the man who both lived it and theorized it. The doctrine that bears Augustine's name most forcefully, original sin, the teaching that human beings are born in a state of inherited guilt and damaged will, unable to turn toward God without divine grace acting first, was not fully formalized until the controversy with the British monk Pelagius, which developed in earnest around 411 AD. Pelagius argued that human beings possess genuine freedom of choice, that sin is individual decision rather than inherited nature, and that grace operates through moral example and encouragement rather than through the interior transformation of a fundamentally wounded will. The Church sided with Augustine at the Council of Carthage in 418 AD. The Western Christian tradition, Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed, and most Protestant denominations, has been operating on Augustine's framework for the nature of the human will ever since. What is almost never said in discussions of that doctrine is this: the man who argued most forcefully that the human will is fractured, that the body transmits inherited guilt across generations, that natural generation itself carries the marks of original transgression. That man had watched his son enter the baptismal water at 15 and had buried that son at 17. He had also, years before, removed the boy's mother from his household as an obstacle to a more suitable arrangement. The doctrine is not reducible to the biography. Theology is not autobiography, but the biographical texture is real, and it has been sitting in Confessions, Book 9, Chapter 6, for 1600 years. There is a written companion to this series for those who want to go further into these primary sources. I have put together the Hidden Confessions, 7 truths Augustine of Hippo kept from the world, and what they reveal about faith, sin, and the birth of Christianity. The link is in the first comment, and if you are watching on a screen, the QR code is there now. It covers the passages from De Magistro, the Confessions, and the anti-Pelagian writings in detail, and includes 5 bonuses: the Augustine 30-day reading plan, the early church visual timeline, 100 quotes from the Church Fathers, the Heresies Guide, and the first 3 chapters audiobook. What is the question about Augustine you most wish someone had answered for you directly? What do we actually know, as a matter of documented historical record, about Adeodatus as a person, separate from his theological function in his father's later writings? We know he was born approximately 372 AD in Carthage. We know he traveled north to Milan with Augustine around 383 AD at approximately 11 years old. We know he was present at the philosophical discussions at Cassiciacum in the autumn of 386 AD at approximately 14. We know his name appears in De Beata Vita among the named participants in the recorded conversation. We know Augustine, writing in De Magistro and in revisions, credited the boy's intellect to divine formation rather than to anything the father himself had contributed. We know he was baptized at the Easter Vigil in Milan on the night of April 24th into April 25th, 387 AD. We know the group traveled to Ostia, where Monica died. We know they waited in Rome. We know they returned to North Africa. We know Adeodatus died sometime in 388 or 389 AD, at approximately 17 years old. We know Augustine wrote one sentence about it. That list is everything we have. It is also almost nothing. Augustine returned to Thagaste, his hometown in what is today northeastern Algeria, after arriving back in North Africa. He established a small community of men dedicated to prayer, reading, and shared life, an early form of what would later be codified as monastic practice in the Western Church. He wrote. He corresponded extensively with bishops, scholars, and friends across the Mediterranean world. He studied scripture with a rigor that would eventually produce some of the most influential biblical commentary in the ancient world. In 391 AD, visiting the city of Hippo, he was pressed into ordination as a priest by the bishop Valerius and the congregation, against what he later described as his own reluctance and distress. He became co-bishop of Hippo in 395 AD and full bishop upon Valerius's death. He served in that role for 35 years, until the Vandals were besieging the city walls in 430 AD. Adeodatus does not appear in those 35 years, not in the letters, not in the sermons, not in the treatises, not in the extensive anti-Pelagian writings. The boy baptized beside his father at midnight in Milan appears in De Magistro, appears in Confessions, and is not mentioned again in any text the early church fathers produced, by Augustine or by anyone who knew him. That is when everything changed. The scholar Garry Wills, in his 1999 study St. Augustine, published by Penguin Lives, touches on the retrospective quality of the Confessions and what it means for how we should read its emotional register. Wills notes that Augustine was not writing a diary or a memoir in the conventional sense. He was composing a sustained theological prayer addressed to God, structured at every point by the interpretive framework he had built in the decade between the events and the act of writing them. The Augustine of 397 AD who writes, "I recall him without anxiety," about his dead son, is not the man who stood at a graveside in 388 or 389 AD. He is a man who has had 10 years to integrate that loss into a theological account that explains it, contains it, and gives it meaning. The Confessions is not dishonest about this process, but it is easy, and it has been common for 16 centuries of readers, to mistake the retrospective piece of the writing for the texture of the original experience. Here is the part that changes how you read the Confessions. Augustine's arguments about original sin, as they developed in his writings against Pelagius beginning around 411 AD, particularly in De Peccatorum Meritis et Remissione, on the merit and forgiveness of sins, included the striking position that infants dying without baptism were subject to damnation. He acknowledged the severity of this conclusion. He did not retreat from it. Its logic followed directly from his central premise. Original sin is transmitted through the act of natural generation itself, and baptism administered by the Church is the only available remedy. A child born of natural generation carries inherited guilt. Without baptism, that condition persists beyond death. The man who formulated that position had baptized his own son. He had watched his son die within 2 years of that baptism. When Augustine wrote, "I recall him without anxiety, fearing nothing for his childhood, his adolescence, or the whole of his person," the anxiety he is not recalling includes a very specific fear that his own doctrinal system would eventually make fully explicit: the fear for the unbaptized child. Adeodatus was baptized. He received the remedy the Church could administer. The sentence of peace is not simply the peace of a father who has moved through grief. It is also the peace of a man whose theological framework has given him a specific doctrinal reason to believe that his child is held. Those two things are not the same. And the distance between them is where the history lives. You may be sitting with something that has no clean theological name. The sense that the frameworks we construct around our losses are also shaped by those losses, that doctrine and experience are not separate streams that occasionally intersect, but are the same water moving through the same landscape. Augustine's Confessions is the most famous case study in that process that the Western Christian tradition possesses. It is also the one most often read without that question anywhere near the surface. If what this episode has uncovered is the kind of history you have been looking for, the primary sources, the actual dates, the documented debates, the real human texture behind the theological vocabulary that formed the faith you practice or the faith you are trying to understand, there is more waiting for you in this series. Every episode goes deeper into the history most Christians were never given. The council debates, the early church fathers, the manuscripts that changed doctrine, the real lives behind the doctrines. Subscribe and turn on notifications so none of it reaches you late. This series exists for the questions your education did not answer. The boy's name meant given by God. He was baptized at midnight in Milan on the night before Easter, 387 AD, standing in the water beside a father who had spent a decade searching for exactly this moment. He was described in his father's writing as an intellect formed not by anything Augustine himself had contributed, but by God alone, a gift, in the most literal sense the father knew how to express. He was dead before he was 18. His mother's name does not appear in any document the historical record has preserved. Augustine went on to become the most influential single theologian the Western Christian tradition produced. He shaped the doctrine of grace, the understanding of free will, the vocabulary of original sin, the framework for the relationship between the church and the state, the concept of the two cities that would run through centuries of Christian political thought. He wrote until the Vandals were at the gates. He died in 430 AD, 41 years after the year his son died, having not written the name Adeodatus again after Confessions, Book 9. There is a question this story leaves open that no primary source can answer. It is not about doctrine. It is not strictly about history. It is the kind of question that lives at the edge of what any written record can reach. The question of what a person carries in the spaces between the sentences, and whether the architecture we build around silence is a form of faith or a form of protection, and whether there is finally a difference between the two. Augustine wrote one sentence about the death of his son. That sentence has survived 1600 years. What surrounds it has survived just as long. You have now read both. What you do with that is a question only you can carry forward.